Welcome back. So this is the second video I've done on the subject of bands that knew when to quit or went out on top, so to speak. So just for reference, the ones I covered in the first video, the Beatles, probably the obvious example, Led Zeppelin, the Sex Pistols, think about it, one and done, and the Police, another great example of a band that went out on top of their game. So I'm going to feature 3 new bands today, all of which I think absolutely qualify. But here's where I'm going to need your help. You guys always have great suggestions in the comments. But when you really stop and think about it, there aren't too many bands that went out on top. I mean, we usually see the opposite, right? There are so many bands out there that just dragged it out far too long to the point where it became embarrassing, many of them still going to this day. So let me know. I suspect you guys are going to be able to come up with some great suggestions that I might use in a future video. And finally, if you enjoy this channel, please take a moment to like, subscribe, ring the bell icon for notifications, and possibly even consider a financial contribution. Those are very much appreciated. Look in the description of the video for ways that you can do that. Buy me a coffee, Zelle, PayPal, etc. All right, let's do it. I am just a poor boy, though my story's seldom told. Do I even need to say it? That, of course, The Boxer, one of a handful of stone-cold classics from Simon & Garfunkel's Swan Song LP, Bridge Over Troubled Water, an album which supplied 4 of the tracks that appeared on Simon & Garfunkel's first and most legendary greatest hits package, including the title track, El Condor Pasa, The Boxer, and Cecilia. And that's not to mention several other great tracks that fly a bit more under the radar. Things like The Only Living Boy in New York, one of my favorites, and Keep the Customer Satisfied. Now, why do I say these guys went out on top? Well, I think I've already made the case that this final album contains several of the group's most important songs. But what about record sales, you might say? There are plenty of bands that maybe make a great final album, but by that point, their 15 minutes of fame have expired and no one really cares. Well, Bridge Over Troubled Water has gone 8 times platinum, far and away the best-selling studio album that Simon & Garfunkel ever released. The 2 nearest contenders being Sounds of Silence and Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme, both of which went 3 times platinum. Those 2 releases were followed up by Bookends, another great album, but which saw a decline in sales to only 2 million. I know that sounds crazy. How many artists would kill for 2 million? But I suspect at the time critics might have speculated, oh, that's it, they're on the downward spiral. Well, if there was any such talk, it was quickly put to rest by a blockbuster performance from Bridge Over Troubled Water. All right, so I suppose really the only other remaining measure of success in the music industry is critical response. Now, this one is very unimportant to me personally. I could kind of care less just because I think most so-called rock critics are a bunch of jackasses. But let's say we want to take that into account. As you can see, the critical response was quite positive. This is just from the Wikipedia page for the Bridge Over Troubled Water album. And you don't see too many albums doing better than this. All of which begs the question, why on earth would these guys break up on the heels of an album that sold 8 million? And I think the simple answer is Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel just couldn't get along. In the end, I think that's the most common reason why musical acts break up. But this was an extreme case. I don't think you could find 2 human beings less similar than Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel. Starting with physically, right? Paul Simon is a very short man with dark hair. Art Garfunkel is much taller, with a head of golden curly hair that probably added 2 or 3 more inches to the height disparity. Simon was all business, very disciplined, and 100% dedicated to his music. Garfunkel, on the other hand, was something of a free spirit, who at one point developed a habit of hitchhiking to the gigs and giving Simon heart attacks by showing up at the last possible second. That just doesn't sound like a partnership that was destined to last. And if that wasn't enough, Garfunkel also angered Simon by pursuing an acting career, which severely hindered the recording of the Bridge Over Troubled Water album. Garfunkel did pretty well as an actor for a brief period, appearing in films such as Catch-22 and Carnal Knowledge, but you can understand why Simon would have been upset with this. So to sum up, I'm going to give you my theory about what went down here. Of course, I could be way off base, but it seems to me that the Simon and Garfunkel partnership was always pretty lopsided. Simon wrote all the material. He did at least half the singing, if not more. Now, granted, Garfunkel's voice was far more beautiful. I think Bridge Over Troubled Water in particular would never have had the impact that it has if Simon had sung it. But still, I think Garfunkel was very intimidated by Simon's dominance within the duo, and he really felt the need to get out there on his own and establish himself as an artist in his own right. Unfortunately, he went about it in a very passive-aggressive way, so that Simon eventually just decided he didn't need the headache and struck out on his own. And of course, history has proved him right, as he went on to have a remarkably successful career as a solo artist. Still, I've got to believe that today, both Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel must be incredibly pleased and proud of what they accomplished with their partnership and the position that they occupied in the pop music world when they went their separate ways all those years ago. Girlfriend in Oklahoma, I know, it's serious. Girlfriend in Oklahoma, I know, it's really serious. There were times when I could have murdered her. I've always held that the Smiths were one of the most important yet most underrated bands of the 1980s alternative rock scene. I guess that's the best way I could describe them. It's amazing to me how they have such a rabid following to this day, but they've always kind of flown under the radar. They received a good amount of airplay on college radio back in the day, but never really cracked mainstream radio. A handful of tunes got a little bit of airplay, things like How Soon Is Now and This Charming Man, but never really heavy rotation. Now, another thing that amazes me about the career of the Smiths is its brevity. Their self-titled debut album was released in 1984, and by 1987 they were done. 87 was the year that saw the release of their final album, Strange Ways, Here We Come. And to make it even more incredible, the band had actually broken up before that album was even released. As with Simon and Garfunkel, the breakup of the Smiths basically came down to the inability of two very strong-willed young men to get along. I'm referring, of course, to lead vocalist and lyricist Morrissey and guitarist/composer Johnny Marr. It certainly had nothing to do with waning popularity. Again, at 3 years into their career, the group's upward trajectory in popularity was undeniable. The Smiths were always bigger in the UK than they were in the States, but somewhat frustratingly, they were just starting to break through to the US market when they packed it in. The first two albums, The Smiths and Meat is Murder, went gold in the UK. Then The Queen is Dead came out in 1986 and was a huge breakthrough. That one went 2 times platinum in the UK. and gold in the US. Meanwhile, the final album went gold in both the UK and the US. And while it's true that that was an obvious drop-off in sales from The Queen is Dead, I think that's only to be expected when you drop an album out there and then immediately announce that your band is breaking up. That's got to put a damper on things. And of course, there was no tour in support of the record. I'm convinced that if the band had stayed together, that album would have sold even much more than its already respectable performance. And then there's the fact that upon its release in September of '87, the Strange Ways album climbed to number 2 on the UK charts and became the group's highest charting record in America, reaching number 55 on the Billboard Hot 100. Clearly a lot of momentum going, and just begs the question of how much this group could have accomplished if they had just been able to stick it out even a few years longer. Marr and Morrissey butted heads pretty much from the beginning, but it was Johnny Marr who finally made the bold decision to leave the band in 1987. And as you might expect, musical differences was a huge part of the problem. It so often is. Marr claims that he wanted to take the band into some new musical directions, but that Morrissey stubbornly resisted. But it went deeper than that. The Smiths also, unfortunately, fell victim to what is probably the other biggest band pitfall, and that is poor management. So poor that supposedly Marr was forced to become involved in the band's business activities, something which is never a good thing in my opinion. Much better if you can just focus on the art side of it and have someone who is tough and trustworthy to handle the business side of it. Things became even more acrimonious a couple of years after the breakup when bassist Andy Rourke and drummer Mike Joyce filed a lawsuit for unpaid royalties. It became a big legal mess. And I should mention, even though Morrissey and Marr were clearly the two main driving forces behind the Smiths, both Rourke and Joyce were great players with distinctive styles that had a lot to do with the Smiths sound. You cannot discount that rhythm section. All hopes of a true Smiths reunion were dashed in 2023 with the death of Andy Rourke at the much too young age of 59, following a long battle with pancreatic cancer. Now, as you can imagine, the Smiths have received countless offers over the years to reunite. For his part, Morrissey was once quoted as saying he would rather eat his own testicles than perform again with the Smiths. Funny thing though, time has a way of mellowing such sentiments. In 2024, Morrissey says he received a very lucrative offer for a reunion, which he would have been willing to accept, but Johnny Marr didn't even bother to respond. So bottom line, if I was a betting man, I would go out on a limb and say that the Smiths will never perform together again. And you know, I think that's really for the best. As tempting as it is to wonder whether or not these guys would have anything left in the tank all these years later, the whole point of this video is to give props to those rare few who have the fortitude to leave a beautiful thing untarnished. Me like a Pisces when I am weak. Okay, so I know many of you are probably sitting out there right now saying to yourselves, yeah, of course Nirvana quit on top. When your guitarist, songwriter, and lead vocalist commits suicide, what choice do you have? But I want you to think about this a little bit more closely. It wasn't necessarily a foregone conclusion that Nirvana wouldn't try and continue in some form or another. And I think the best example I can give is The Doors. I mean, is there a more iconic and irreplaceable frontman than Jim Morrison in the history of rock and roll? I doubt it. Also, of course, the band's lyricist, essentially a poet. But many people either don't realize or forget that the Doors released 2 albums after Morrison's death, Other Voices in 1971 and Full Circle in 1972. The fact that they sort of disappeared without a trace, I guess, is why people don't know about them. And while that might be the most extreme example, there are others. What about AC/DC continuing on after the death of Bon Scott? Many at the time thought that group was over and that it would be sacrilege to continue without Bon, who was looked at as the heart and soul of the group. But as we all know, they went on to recruit Brian Johnson and make what was by far their best-selling album ever and one of the best-selling rock albums of all time. And one more comparison that I think is very instructive just because the dynamics between the two groups were so similar, and that is the band Sublime, which came into prominence right around the same time as Nirvana in the early to mid-90s. It's crazy the parallels here. Both were 3-piece groups, and like Kurt Cobain, Sublime's Bradley Nowell was the guitar player, the songwriter, and the lead vocalist. And sadly, as with Nirvana, he passed away in 1996 from a heroin overdose. But the parallels end there because eventually Sublime decided to carry on without Nowell. Now granted, it took a long time. As mentioned, Nowell died in 96, and it wasn't until 2009 they started a project they called Sublime with Rome, Rome Ramirez being Nowell's replacement. And the band has carried on, off and on, literally up until last year. In May of 2024, they released an album called Love is Dangerous and then disbanded. So I'd be curious to know if there are any hardcore Sublime fans out there watching. Were you pleased that the group carried on so long, or do you think they tarnished their image by doing so? I don't have much of an opinion on that one, but I can say that as a Nirvana fan, I'm really glad that Nirvana ended with Kurt Cobain. Nirvana's final studio album was 1993's In Utero, which has sold over 15 million. I'd say that qualifies as going out on top, yeah? Now, I know some of you might be thinking, yeah, but the previous album, Nevermind, sold 30 million, so In Utero was a failure, but that's not the right way to think about it for a couple of reasons. Number one, when you sell 30 million copies of an album, you're up among the greatest selling albums of all time. And the bottom line is you don't repeat that. When you reach that level of sales, I don't know if it's the right word to use, but I would almost say there's a bit of luck involved. It has to come at just the right time and sort of magically resonate with the current musical zeitgeist. Nevermind was one of those albums that defined its generation, much like, say, Hotel California and Rumors defined the 70s, maybe Back in Black defined hard rock in the 80s. And if you look at sales figures for the follow-ups to all 3 of those classic albums I just mentioned, you'll see that all did extremely well, but none came close to their predecessor. It's just not a realistic expectation. And another very important factor here, as crazy as it sounds, you could literally argue that Kurt Cobain did not want In Utero to sell as much as Nevermind. Cobain was obviously a very tortured individual who was terrified of being viewed as abandoning his punk rock ethos and becoming a sellout with the runaway success of Nevermind. I know it sounds crazy to most of us, but this is not uncommon with many artists. In Utero is undoubtedly a much more raw album than Nevermind. The production is gritty. The tunes are probably not as instantly catchy. There are stories that Geffen initially refused to release the record due to its uncommercial nature. There are also stories that Cobain had to be coerced into adding harmony vocals on several of the tunes to sweeten things up. The album's producer was Steve Albini, but right at the last, another producer, Scott Litt, best known for his work with REM, was hired to mix the album's first two singles, Heart-Shaped Box and All Apologies, again, in an effort to come up with something a bit more commercial. But in the end, as mentioned, in spite of all the controversy, In Utero sold by the truckload, as did the follow-up live album, MTV Unplugged in New York. And if that wasn't enough, Nirvana was set to headline the 1994 Lollapalooza Festival, a sure sign that the group was on top of the alternative rock world during this period, until Cobain pulled the group out at the last minute due to his own health issues and, wait for it, his concern that playing the festival would be seen as a sellout move. Sadly, this really was an obsession with him. And to me, that makes it all the more special that surviving members Dave Grohl and Chris Novoselic have chosen to honor the band's legacy by not putting together some half-assed project that trades on the Nirvana name. I've got to believe that's the way Kurt would have wanted it. So that's it for now. I think I've made a compelling case that Simon and Garfunkel, the Smiths, and Nirvana were three acts that achieved that rarest of feats, quitting while they were on top. But of course, I want to know what you guys think. And again, let me know if you have some other potential candidates for a future video on this subject, because I would like to do more on this subject. All right, thanks as always. Talk soon.